So welcome once again to the Best Anchors Talk podcast. Today I have with me Doug and Lawrence from the Preferred Shares podcast. We're going to talk about a very interesting topic. Actually, it's kind of a special podcast because instead of talking about, let's say, general investment topics or a particular company, we're going to talk about a trend and how that trend impacts businesses and eventually how those businesses are reflected, the performance of those businesses are reflected in some stocks. So before going right into the episode, why don't you guys introduce yourself? Although I believe that a lot of listeners probably already know you.
Sure, I'll go first. I'm Lawrence Hamtil. I'm a portfolio manager / investment advisor at Fortune Financial Advisors in Overland Park, Kansas. It's a smallish to mid-sized boutique RIA just on the outskirts of Kansas City, and we manage around 150 million in assets.
And I'm Douglas Otts. I'm the founder and chief investment officer of Andavari Associates. We are also a small boutique investment advisor, and we're based to the south of Atlanta, Georgia. And we got started in 2013 with a little over 3 million in assets under management, and I've been able to grow that on my own to about a little over 16 million right now. So happy to be on the podcast. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah,
Thank you guys for coming. I think it's going to be interesting because we're going to talk about topics that maybe are not touched on a lot of podcasts. Well, definitely they are touched on yours, right? But your podcast is maybe not conventional. So I think that the best place to start is what's the trend that we are going to talk about and where does it come from, right? A bit of history on the trend.
Well, Doug, of course, is located in the South, so he sees this firsthand, and he and I have been talking about this over the months that we've been working on preferred shares, and a lot of companies that we follow have talked about this trend, this mega trend that has been going on for decades of population and businesses moving from the North and the old Midwest to the South and the Southeast. A lot of that has to do with warmer climates. Maybe people who retire out of New York or Connecticut, move to Florida, that kind of thing. Also, businesses moving south for more favorable tax treatments and kind of following the population shift. And the more we looked into it, the more we realized that this has been going on for a long time, but also shows no signs of slowing down. And so we just wanted to pursue that a little bit more, flesh it out, and kind of put some structure to what exactly is going on and what are the implications for various industries and investors who follow them.
Yeah, and to be fair, we're both, I would call us bottoms-up investors. So we look at more individual companies and their fundamentals, but this was a fun project gathering more of the macroeconomic data and from the various government resources that the United States has. And there's also been many anecdotes. If you're an investor or a person in finance or business, you might see in the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal sporadically over the years, this super wealthy hedge fund manager is fed up with taxes in Illinois or New York City, and they're picking up shop to move down to Florida or Texas. But the trend is definitely much prevalent than just the upper echelon of people in business. And it's a trend that has been going on for several generations, and it affects both people and businesses. And it was a really fun piece to work on with Lawrence.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I'll leave the paper and the podcast in the show notes. So I think that the first maybe natural follow-up would be, what are the reasons? You discussed some of this right now, but what are the reasons behind this trend, right? Why is it happening? And maybe we could try to see which one of those reasons are more relevant than the others, right? Because I believe that some have more, let's say, probably staying power than the others.
I think if you kind of go back to the post-World War II period, the South was relatively underdeveloped compared to the rest of the United States. Some of that's a legacy of the Civil War, Reconstruction, just a kind of a more impoverished area. And so when you had a couple of things that came about, I mean, we didn't really discuss this in the paper, but air conditioning is a huge factor. So it made a lot of the environment habitable for people. They could live in comfort. So the sort of oppressive heat in the South wasn't such a big factor, especially when it related to working conditions, not just thinking about your home where you live, but where you work. And then also the interstate highway system, which came about in the 50s under the Eisenhower administration, that opened up the South because of a lot of infrastructure was being built. So previously, states were responsible for their own highways, and the South, being a relatively poor region, didn't have the resources to construct highways like the North and the upper Midwest did. And so when you had this sort of leveling of the playing field with all the federal money coming in, building highways, it opened up Tennessee, Arkansas, Georgia, all these different states to investment, because all of a sudden now you had infrastructure that could compete. And so that just really made a huge compelling case for companies to start to look at that region as a place to do business. And of course, as population started to shift down there naturally because of warmer climates, better conditions, and so on, it's kind of a chicken or the egg question, which one followed which, but they all sort of kind of developed contemporaneously.
Yeah, and to give a real good example of just the amount of progress that has been made in certain states in the southern part of the United States. If you go back to 1947, and we have this in our paper, but the total per capita income of the United States as a whole was about $1,300 and $1,350. If you look at the individual state of Arkansas, their per capita income was $740. So that's about 45% less than the national average. And going over time, Arkansas and other similar states have closed that gap to now they're about 20% less than the national average. And they've obviously grown at a faster rate thanks to all the investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, do you think of companies that have come about there, like Walmart, famously headquartered in Arkansas now, JB Hunt Transportation, FedEx in Tennessee, Delta's headquartered in Atlanta, I believe. So all of these major companies have either relocated there or they sprung up organically over the years. So it's really been a huge shift from the old power centers of the Northeast and the upper Midwest, and moving to the South, Southeast, and so on.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting because if I talk with someone about this trend of people, let's say, migrating to the south of the United States, probably a lot of people would say, oh, yeah, that's a trend from COVID, right? Because a lot of people could work from home. But it's actually interesting that you mentioned that it goes back to the interstate highway system, right? That it's, let's say, 70 years ago or a bit more than 70 years ago. So if we are 70 years, let's say, into this trend, obviously, maybe it has accelerated lately and maybe it has accelerated due to COVID. Where would you say we are in the trend and how sustainable is it? I mean, are we in the third inning? Are we in the fourth inning, or where are we?
It's hard to put an endpoint on the trend. We know that it definitely exists, and it is absolutely true that COVID and the ability to work from home accelerated that trend. And it's not just going from north to south, but it's been going from urban to suburban or urban to rural, more rural parts of the country. But to look at some of the historical data, you can look at the population for the various regions of the United States. Going back to 1970, roughly 50 years ago, the population of the South as a percent of the total country was about a little over 30%. Okay. And now it's grown to, it'll probably reach 40% in the next decade is my best guess. But trying to figure out where the trend will stop or reach a period of stasis where there's no more fluctuations between the various regions, that's really hard to estimate. But I think it will keep going on as long as the major reasons for migration are continue to be apparent to business and people. And we've just talked about climate as one big reason, but there are other regulatory factors involved and also more tax and money issues involved, of course. The southern states typically have lower average corporate and personal income tax rates. They're generally more business friendly. And even in the past several weeks, we've had yet another large Fortune 500 company, Chevron, make an announcement that they're moving their corporate headquarters from California to Texas. And they've been in California for over 100 years. They're definitely not the first large company to leave. It's been happening more and more frequently over just the last 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you kind of have to ask yourself what is going to stop this trend or slow it down, and then what are the states that are hemorrhaging population going to do to sort of stop their own loss of their tax base. And it doesn't seem like there's a huge urgency on their part to reform anything or make their states friendlier to I mean, they're sort of at a disadvantage from a climate standpoint because they typically are colder climates and things like that, but they don't really seem to have a lot of urgency to reduce their tax burdens or regulatory burdens. So maybe they think that they can just continue to extract revenue from a static base of maybe a younger population who's still working or doesn't have the option to work remotely. But I really haven't seen anything on that part that shows that they're willing to do what it takes to upgrade their competitiveness relative to the southern states in this sense.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, right? Because in terms of weather, you cannot do much, at least not in the year 2024. Maybe in the future you can do something about the weather. But in terms of business competitiveness, I assume rationally that if you are starting to lose a lot of business, then that you try to do something to keep the businesses that you currently have. Maybe those that have left, that have already left, are not coming back, but sort of level the playing field, right? In that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you would think so, but some of the states, for example, like California, Silicon Valley, that's sort of a irreplaceable asset. That's something that really can't be duplicated or I don't think moved. So, they have an advantage there. Or New York with the financial trading hub and things like that. So those are maybe going to be examples of things that sort of limit any further hemorrhaging from those states or those regions. But you also look at the baby boomer population, which is sort of in the early stages of retirement, where if they're no longer bound by their jobs and they want to move to warmer climates, I mean, you're kind of thinking, okay, well, the baby boomer generation retiring has years to play out. So that in and of itself is a huge shift, maybe in the hundreds of thousands, maybe the millions of people who might be leaving those places if they haven't done so already. So it may not just be the working generation, maybe the retired generation and so on. But then, of course, that those are probably a demographic that's more catered to by service companies and things like that. So the nature of which businesses follow that shift is probably going to change as well.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to add some recent data to this, and it just came out a week or two ago. And this gets to the ratio of interstate migration. So this data basically looks at the number of people in two different demographics: the 65 and older demographic, which is retiree, and then households with over $200,000 of income. And that's the data set. And so in terms of the worst, I mean, not the worst states, but the states with the worst ratio of people leaving versus exiting, for the retiree crowd, it is, it appears to be New York. So they have a ratio of 0.46. So they have 0.46 people coming in for every person that is exiting New York. The next worst ratio is California, which was kind of surprising to me. So again, in that, in both the retiree age population and for households that we would all call, I think, solidly upper middle income, you have in California 0.5 people coming in versus one person leaving California. So that's a hard trend to reverse, given there are many alternative places to live within the U.S. and it just happens to be the most popular region is the South.
Mm-hmm. And if we now look at in the paper, you talk about 3 industries, right? That might be impacted by, well, might be, no, probably are going to be impacted for sure about from this trend. One is infrastructure, which is obviously, I think this is probably the most obvious, right? And straightforward. The other one is retailers, and the other one is homes. So which of the 3 do you think will enjoy let's say, the most significant tailwind? I mean, is the South so underdeveloped with respect to the North that infrastructure companies are going to see like a huge pull forward now, or has it, through the 70 years that this trend has been, let's say, evolving, is the South now more or less equally developed to the North?
Well, I would say on the infrastructure aspect of it, it again sort of depends, because a sort of recent development on that front, it's not highways anymore, it's data centers. And so electricity is a lot cheaper in the in the southern states relative to some other regions. And so you're seeing a lot of data center activity in Virginia, North Carolina, and those areas. And so infrastructure has gotten to be a really big beneficiary for that particular reason. Now, of course, that sort of spending is cyclical. So, it's sort of hard to duplicate that on a repeated basis. And sure, there's going to be some ups and downs, and it really depends on the type of infrastructure that you're talking about. But as factories come in, there's a lot of foreign auto companies that have factories in the South. They all require a lot of electricity, so cheap natural gas, those types of things. If you consider those infrastructure, those are going to be continued beneficiaries. Aggregates companies are going to benefit from that as well. You're going to have more road construction, highway maintenance, things like that. But probably to a large extent, the best growth is probably behind those categories. I kind of think with with the influx of population, specialty retailers, service companies, whether it's pest control, pool cleaning, pool maintenance, the opportunity set there is still relatively large, because you're going to have continued household formation. Still a lot of that left to be determined. So to me, that seems a little bit more early in its development than some of the infrastructure stuff. I don't know if Doug agrees with that, but
Yeah, I generally agree with that. In terms of the infrastructure, I think what the focus is on now, we've I think the South has been fully accommodated with the basic and bare underlying infrastructure. And now it's primarily focused on expanding that for the continuing growth in population. And just to give you one example that keeps blowing my mind, that I've cited on a few other podcast interviews, is that in the state of Georgia, we've got a sizable infrastructure project. It's basically a 2-lane highway specifically for 18-wheeler, tractor trailer trucks. It goes north from Macon, Georgia to Atlanta, which is about a 75 mile project. But it's to get these large trucks off of the main highway itself, so that we can be more efficient and also more safe with the regular smaller passenger vehicles. And this is a $2 or $3 billion project that'll be completed in the next 5 or 6 years, and it's the only highway of its kind in the entire United States. It only goes one direction, and it's really just to accommodate, to enhance the logistical infrastructure of Georgia and the rest of the Southeast.
Mm-hmm. And I think you talked there also about homes, right, with pest control and pools. I mean, I think everyone is well aware that there might be, and this is happening in a lot of countries, right, the supply imbalance with housing, because since the global financial crisis, there wasn't a lot of construction, right, and you have population growth, people are demanding homes, and maybe we are behind in the curve, and this is happening, I think, in many countries. Do you think this supply imbalance, or maybe you have the data, but is this supply imbalance more pronounced in the South than in the North, or is it more or less equal in the US?
It's kind of hard to say. I don't know that we split out the data specifically as far as like new housing starts in that sense, but affordability is still relatively good in the South compared to other regions, which is one of the reasons why. I mean, the land tends to be a little more open, more easily developed. So I think that's sort of a reason to be bullish on housing construction in the South. They also have the benefit of having a lot of the timberlands there, which of course timber is a major input cost to housing. So being close to the forests and things where that wood is harvested, I think sort of helps that region develop compared to others. But it's also more spread out. So there's less density. So there's just easier tracts of land to clear out, develop, and build new houses. So you can buy a lot of house for a similar price to what you could get in places like California and New York. Plus the grid is less densely packed in, for lack of a better way to explain it. So putting in all of the infrastructure for the housing developments is quite a bit easier than trying to add on more to what are already taxed electrical grids and so on in the Northeast, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a trend that we've seen on social media, right? Where you see someone saying, this is what 1 million buys you in California, and it's like a trailer house, and this is what 1 million buys you in Texas, and it's like a mansion.
Exactly right.
Yeah, I think that also applies to Vancouver even more.
And I think two very interesting industries that are related to infrastructure. And funny thing, when I contacted you, Lawrence, the first thing I said is that it might be interesting to talk about aggregates and cement, because I know you've written a paper on that. And then you told me, no, but let's do this. That is better. We're going to talk about the whole trend, which I obviously agree with. But aggregates and cement are quite interesting, right? Because they have local monopolies. So then you have companies that, let's say, sort of dominate the South, and those in the North cannot compete with those in the South, because transporting the cement or the aggregates, it's so heavy that the transportation costs add up so much to the end cost that basically the closest quarry has the competitive advantage, or the closest cement operator. So how in this industry, who do you think is best positioned in terms of the migration to the South? Because a lot of the aggregates companies, the large ones, right? You have Vulcan, you have Martin Marietta. All of them basically say that they are exposed to the South, right? So
Right.
and that they are going to grow a lot in the South because they have prepared for this trend. I don't know if you have any thoughts around who might be the beneficiaries of these trends in terms of aggregates and cement.
Well, I'll say, in full disclosure, I own a little bit of Martin Marietta, so do some of our clients. And so
Mm-hmm.
I kind of favor favor them a little bit. But I do think that there's plenty of room for several operators. If you think about the industry itself, it's extremely fragmented. So the big players, Vulcan, Martin, there's a couple others, CRH, they probably together or all together make up maybe 50 to 55% of the quarries that are in operation in terms of ownership. So there's still quite a few mom and pop or maybe third generation quarries that were opened up under the Eisenhower administration. I mean, we kind of forget that it was the interstate highway that sort of pushed the aggregates industry into the modern era. And so a lot of these quarries were licensed and developed to support the interstate highway development. There's still a lot of those that can be consolidated by these major players. And so it's really kind of like, who are the major operators who stand to be the maybe the acquirer of choice for these smaller operations? And I think just based on regional footprint, Vulcan and Martin Marietta have a head start on just about everybody else. That's not to say that others can't compete, but they have a. What was interesting too, though, is a lot of these aggregates operators, they're actively divesting some of their non-aggregates businesses. So they're getting out of asphalt, getting out of cement, focusing almost exclusively on quarries and aggregates and so on. So I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see what they really want to do with their businesses going forward. And certainly they want to benefit from the infrastructure spending that's taking place in the South. But at the same time, they're seem to be focusing exclusively on one part of that value chain in the construction business, as opposed to trying to serve all parts of it, which I think maybe was the case beforehand.
And Lawrence, I just want to add on to that acquirer of choice comment. And I think both Vulcan and Martin Marietta, they have their roots deeply in the South. Vulcan is based in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin, I think, was founded in North Carolina. Is that right?
I think so.
So given that, and who knows why a third generation quarry owner would sell what their most important factor is, whether it's price or whether it's just the right culture of the company that's acquiring them. But I tend to think that usually the right culture in a situation like this will give, assuming the third generation quarry is based somewhere in the South or Southeast, that would give a slight advantage to companies like Vulcan and Martin Marietta. Whereas if you're a large corporation based in Europe, like Lafarge or CRH, you might be at a slight disadvantage in terms of being able to acquire the remaining 55% of quarries in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think you kind of see that the data. I mean, all of their IR teams are very good at putting out their slideshow presentations where their big footprints are. And Vulcan and Martin are definitely the big players in the South. I think CRH has a bigger presence in the Northeast and so on. So it wouldn't be surprise me if they just each kind of continued to sort of consolidate further their already wide footprints in their respective regions of dominance or preference, however you want to phrase it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's an interesting industry because, I mean, I hold a company in the aggregates industry. It's not either Vulcan or Martin Marietta, but throughout history, these companies tend to have were vertically integrated, right? Because aggregates was an input into, let's say, the concrete and the asphalt, right? So they needed those businesses to be able to source all of their volume and to be profitable in the aggregates operations. But then something has changed, right? And everything has sort of specialized. I think this has happened in a lot of industries, right? Where complexity was growing and then the value chain specialized. And I also think, I mean, if I had to compare aggregates and cement, and I actually have an article talking about this, but when I studied both industries, I think aggregates is probably the better business, right? Obviously, it depends on the price you pay for the businesses. But in aggregates, the good thing is as in cement, the entry barriers are super high, right? Because nobody wants a quarry in their backyard, and getting the permits can take up to a decade. Something similar happens with cement and a cement plant, right? Because there are environmental regulations that don't allow cement companies like to build whatever they want. But at the same time, what I felt with cement companies is that you're going to get a lot of regulatory capex, right? Because they are going to tell you you have to comply with this regulation, new environmental regulation. So then you need to spend capex, and you're seeing that in the cement companies that are spending quite a bit of capex, but not to expand capacity, just um, to to comply with regulations. But at the same time, obviously, then you think, okay, this is mission critical, very high barriers to entry. So these companies, cement companies, probably are going to push up price, right? Because they are getting the capex, and they want to keep their margins. And when they push up price, if all of them are subject to the same regulation, then you as a construction company probably don't have another choice but to face those price increases, right? So I'm a bit torn in because if you look at cement companies and aggregate companies, I mean, a lot of these are trading, let's say, at hefty multiples, right? Compared to history. At the same time, you have the doubt that maybe we're somewhere close to peak cycle, because these are cyclical companies, even if the long-term trend is there. I don't know where you guys stand in that argument. I mean, do you think we are at sort of peak cycle for these companies, and how do you think, or do you think these businesses have fundamentally changed because now they are exposed to the south and the entry barriers are so high that they are basically in control of their pricing?
Well, I kind of think if you look at aggregates in isolation, this is sort of how I frame it. If you break it down, you can kind of, and we put this on our preferred shares show notes, which we can happy to share, but you can plot it out and see that the companies that have the most aggregates exposure typically have higher multiples than those with lower aggregates exposure. So I think the market is, first of all, recognizing that it's just a more valuable business. It's an advantage business because if there is no demand for the aggregates, you just can leave it in the ground. You don't have to blast it and extract it. So in a way, it's kind of like a royalty company in that sense. It's not a perfect analogy, but it somewhat fits. Unlike cement, where you have these high fixed costs, these things that you have to keep sort of active, even when there's not much demand, just to kind of keep the cash flow coming in. So you're at a disadvantage there. And plus, you can just see from the data, I don't believe, have been a single year of year over year price decreases in aggregates. So, they've over 50 plus years or so, everybody seems to know that the stuff in the ground is going to be worth more next year and the year after that, and so on. Plus, you look at it's a much more critical part of roads. I think it's 10% of a road versus 2 to 3% of a construction build. So it just kind of shows you road building is a lot less cyclical. When the economy is in a tailspin or something, the government stimulates by spending money on road repairs and things like that. So I don't know if that means that the businesses have fundamentally changed and therefore the current multiples are warranted. That's sort of up to each investor to decide. But I do think that they are optimizing their portfolios to be more aggregates focused, to be more efficient capital allocators. And of course, when you look at the opportunity set for consolidation still within the industry, there's a lot of opportunity there to grow even within the industry. And we're looking at volumes for aggregates, which are still well below the 2006, 2007 peak. And yet revenues are far higher, which demonstrates their immense pricing power.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say something, Doug?
Yeah, I just want to agree with Lawrence. I think the difference in multiple is, again, the recognition that the aggregates focused businesses are higher quality, and that's because they have greater pricing power. And the pricing power has come, I think, partly from the fact that there are less heavy fixed costs and more variable costs. And another thing Lawrence and I have been talking about recently, in terms of what we want to do for our next white paper, the next topic might be a focus on any business that has significant revenues coming from the government, and how the returns to shareholders and to the company might be different compared to companies that don't have significant government revenue sources. So the fact that roads and bridges and highways, they're all built by local, state, federal governments. And that, again, I think that adds to the quality and adds to the greater predictability of these types of businesses. It might not be the fastest growing businesses, but you can always count on state, federal governments spending money to ensure that roads and highways are safe and that there's enough room to drive everywhere for businesses and people.
Yeah, there's hardly ever a recession in government spending is kind of one of my philosophies. So, you might as well sort of get on the gravy train, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, one could argue that maybe even government spending is counter-cyclical, right? Because when you're in a recession, they are going to try to stimulate the economy with fiscal measures, and one of them is spending on construction. I mean, we've seen that over and over again. Do you think there's a downside to being sort of dependent on the government in terms? I mean, I know Aggregates makes up probably very small part, right, of the total cost of a project. But do you think there's a downside in that if the government is, let's say, the primary end customer, that they'll in the future maybe intervene the price increases that they're trying to push through?
It sort of depends. I think you see that more in things like aerospace, where you have these kind of fights between Airbus and Boeing, or there's
How about healthcare?
Yeah, healthcare, right? Where you have 2 or 3 companies competing for major contracts that can make or break a company, where they've spent a large amount of money of their own to invest in R&D to develop this product for the government. To me, I would think that those risks are higher in those types of situations. For something like Aggregates, where you're selling a critical but non-core piece that's absolutely essential, and the total cost is basically a rounding error and perspective relative to the total cost of the project, it's maybe less. Although on the flip side, it's always going to have a limit to its growth, which might sort of be a turnoff to some investors who are kind of looking for more rapid growth, and so they want to have more potential end customers. So it sort of depends on what you're looking to accomplish.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I don't think also the regulatory scrutiny really exists at all to the same degree that it does for pharma and healthcare. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a senator or a representative losing their mind because Martin Marietta is charging too much for gravel. Whereas I think we've seen enough Senate hearings when it comes to the banking and financial industry, and also the pharmaceutical industry and the oil and gas industry, where
Right.
executives are dragged in to be grilled in front of senators and representatives. That won't happen with the Aggregates business.
Yeah, I mean, and GDP is nominal, right? So maybe it's if you want to go out of a recession, it's better if they push price up so that you get it. I agree that Aggregates is more of a durable business rather than a fast growth business, and it's interesting because I think I'm looking into more companies where pricing, obviously if there's no regulatory scrutiny, is more of a driver than volume, right? Because that, in my opinion, means that you are much more in control of your future, right? I mean, if you are able to, if you have pricing power, that means that whatever the future brings, you are going to be in a position of maybe being able to offset the decreased volumes that may come in the future. But you are not going to be able to increase volumes. Well, you can, right? But in many industries where that happens is because you are lowering prices. So that's why I tend to gravitate maybe to industries like Aggregates, industries like luxury, right? Because in luxury, many true luxury companies don't depend on the volume they sell, because they know that they have some customers to which they can put price. I think if you go back to a global financial crisis, this is very evident because these companies with pricing power tend to be very, very resilient. Even in the case of luxury, if it's like completely nonsense in terms of economic logic, that in a recession they are being resilient, but it happens, right? So I think aggregates and cement probably fit in that mold. Okay, so now I think we've seen who is going to be the beneficiaries of this trend. And now I think we should go to the flip side, right? I mean, a lot of, Doug, you talked about some data. Cities like New York, the state of California, they are losing population. So do you think that there are some clear losers in those states? So maybe companies that are overexposed to the north rather than the south?
That's a good question, and I don't think we've really thought about explicitly who the losers or laggards in terms of businesses and industries might be. I can always harp on the fact that the banking industry is just always tough to be in, and my best guess is that any more regional focused banking group in the Northeast or upper Midwest would tend to fare a little worse than banking groups in the South and Southeast. But then again, on the flip side, which I mentioned in the paper, just the fact that you have a growing population and you're a regional bank focused on the Southeast, that just means competition is going to be that much greater for you. And that could in turn also increase the odds that you make more loans to riskier people, or you start to chase more growth than you should. I don't have a great answer for your question, but maybe I've given Lawrence enough time to think of a better answer.
Well, we've kind of talked about doing a follow-up because you're right. I mean, there's if one side is benefiting, then somebody else has to be sort of losing this competition. It's kind of hard to say, but I think you can look at it from a few different angles. If the tax base is being depleted, then obviously public services will suffer as a result. So, I mean, that's one sort of thing. Is that investable? I don't know. Maybe you want to avoid the municipal bonds from those states that are bleeding population because they're not going to have the much as good of a tax base to meet those obligations. So that's one possibility. Another might be power consumption. So utilities that are more regionally exposed, are they going to face less demand for their services? Does that really matter? I mean, we did an entire podcast with a utilities expert kind of diving into this topic because it's not entirely clear to me what matters for utilities returns. It's not so simple as supply and demand. There's a lot of regulatory issues and capital allocation decisions and things like that. But primarily, you can kind of look to some previous migrations. I mean, during the 30s, Arkansas and Oklahoma and Missouri lost a lot of population to California. You can look at the post-war populations of Cleveland and St. Louis and Detroit and compare them. I mean, they're basically shelves of their former selves. And so who are the losers there? And I think a lot of it is the local service providers, whether it's local delis and hospitals and churches and companies that cater to the population. But the bigger companies are much more dynamic. They seem to be much more nimble. They're probably going to go where the business is. So I worry less about them than I do for the immediate effects on the population that's somewhat more static and doesn't have really the option of moving away. And so that's why you end up with some blighted communities. I mean, that's a whole other socioeconomic discussion, far different from talking about stocks and so forth. But you can see that that's going to be an issue potentially for a lot of major communities if the trend continues.
Mm-hmm. And this is the almost the last questions, but it's going to be a tough one, right? I know that the trend right now seems, let's say, unstoppable and has been going for some time. What do you think it takes for the trend, maybe not to stop entirely, right? Because that probably doesn't happen. But what does it take it for it to slow down over the coming years?
I think that's an easy question to answer. It would really just take for the southern region to start doing what the Northeast and California have been doing for the past 4 or 5 decades. They have to become less business friendly. They have to raise their taxes. They have to pass more rules and regulations that affect business and people. And when it gets to the point where the equilibrium or the dynamic reverses in terms of cost of living, total tax burden on businesses and people, when it flips the other way, that's when the trend ends. But I don't foresee that happening for several generations, but it definitely can happen. I mean, that is one of the, and you kind of paraphrase James Grant, is the problem with prosperity. You become very prosperous, you can easily start to overspend, overtax, because people are willing to give up their taxes because everyone is so wealthy and doing so well. But then you start to make too many promises that you can't keep in the future, then things might eventually reverse, and you turn into the next Illinois or New Jersey, states with huge deficits, or at least huge liability promises and pension promises that they've made public employees. And that's kind of an impossible situation to be in. But I don't foresee it happening in the South anytime soon, but it definitely can happen over a long period of time. If
You there?
Yep, I think.
Doug cut out for a second there.
Yep.
Oh, oops.
Well, and just to kind of follow up what Doug was saying, I mean, you could kind of give some answer about natural disasters, climate change, those kinds of things. All of those are potential catalysts to reverse the trend. But really, I think you're running into some of the near term issues, which is congestion. You look at cities like Nashville and Atlanta; they're starting to get a little bit, I would say, saturated with population, and we know demand exceeds supply in the near term. So it's going to take a while for some of these urban areas that have taken in an influx of population to digest it and adapt and build out their infrastructure. Some of those things might arrest the trend in the near term, or simply kind of push out even more suburban areas, more urban sprawl, so to speak. But really, to me, it's just, to Doug's point, if some of those policies are reversed, there's a more level playing field as far as taxes go. There's less of an incentive for people and businesses to move. Maybe the weather becomes less of an advantage, all of those sorts of things. But I really think if you look at the history of the United States, it's a history of migrations from the East Coast and the original colonies to the interior, to the West Coast, to it's slowly developed over time. And this may not be the last migration. I mean, there could be other migrations to come, although I'm hard pressed to see that they will be of the same magnitude.
Mm-hmm. I think that this has been a great conversation about a topic that actually, I mean, I was aware that some kind of migration to the south was happening, because I obviously have studied the aggregate companies, and they talk about it a lot. But I think it's very interesting to see how it can impact pretty much any business, right? It has implications for any business in the US, because this is not a small change. So the last question I typically do is, your favorite book can be investment related. Well, before I used to say that it should be investment related, but now I've opened my mind to non-investment related books too. So your favorite book.
Lawrence, go first.
Well, I don't know that I have a favorite book, but I have a lot of favorite books. Let's put it that way. But I do think that one book that I go back to a lot is Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. It's such a massive volume, but it's such a fascinating study by a French aristocrat traveling through the United States in the 1830s and his observations about the early decades of America and his observations on slavery and capitalism and early political functionings and his predictions, most of which turned out to be fairly precocious about the U.S. ultimately competing with Russia for kind of world domination. I mean, it's just kind of a very, very amazing book that has a lot of great insights, and I would recommend anybody to read that and reference it many times.
Mm-hmm.
For my book, I think I will choose The Prize by Daniel Yergin. And I read that over 15 years ago, but it's a book about the history of oil and gas exploration. And one of the things I really appreciated about it, I mean, it's a long book. I mean, it's, starts in Titusville, Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, where, basically the first oil well was drilled in the United States, and up until just recently. But one of the main takeaways, especially for a cyclical business like the oil and gas industry and capital intensive, it really, seeing and reading about the entire swath of history for this one particular industry made me appreciate just the ups and downs, how capital enters and exits based on oil prices. And there were several instances where people around the world thought that oil, this is the last cheap oil we're ever going to see. That happened several times throughout history. And there were several times where people thought
that is happening right now.
So it makes you fully appreciate just the ups and downs and the fact that, again, it's just so interesting to have seen multiple times where people thought oil had run out around the world, but that's clearly not been the case over the last 100 years. So I would really recommend that book to anyone who's interested in business, history, or the oil and gas industry specifically. It's a wonderful book.
I would just add that I agree with Doug. Anything that Daniel Yergin writes is worth reading. So I would encourage you to look up his canon and read just about everything in there.
Mm-hmm. I think that I read once, I don't remember the name of the fund manager, but a fund manager that said that when you bet against human ingenuity, then you're probably going to lose. And I think oil is a great example, right? And maybe a lot of commodities. When things look like we're never going to have more supply, then let's say via new extraction method, like happened with oil, or new material that comes out, then the humans are actually pretty intelligent at working their way through low supply.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, if you look at anything from technologies that increase efficiency to recycling to new materials, it's really amazing, and it probably has no limit to how far it can go.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for coming. I think it was a great conversation. And just a reminder, I'll leave the podcast in the description, and also the white paper about the white paper that we've discussed in the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.